Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 243. How can you simplify the management of your Python projects with one file? What are the advantages of using LazyFrames and polars? Christopher Trudeau is back on the show this week, bringing another batch of PyCoder's weekly articles and projects. We share a recent Real Python tutorial by Ian Currie about managing projects with a pyproject.toml file. This file simplifies Python project configuration by unifying package setup, managing dependencies, and streamlining builds. Christopher continues his exploration of the polars library by covering another Real Python tutorial about working with LazyFrames. He describes how LazyFrames don't contain data, but instead store a set of instructions known as a query plan. We also share several other articles and projects from the Python community, including a news roundup, building a to-do app with Python and Kivy, working with DuckDB directly instead of employing a DataFrame library, discussing fiction and nonfiction books on computer science, a terminal visual effects engine, and a full-stack platform for interactive data apps. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, Chris, welcome back.
Hey there.
Happy Pi Day?
Pi.
Exactly. Yeah, so it's March 14th, 3.14, as happens to be the year that 3.14 will be coming out for Python, so it's fun this year.
Pi squared.
Yeah. I decided to do a section. I don't know if I'm going to do this all the time, but I wanted to do a quick little follow-up thing. We've been talking about testing quite a bit lately, and an area that I was not familiar with, we dug into in 239 about behavior-driven versus test-driven development. And there's a person I've been thinking about getting on the show. He goes by Automation Panda, Andrew Knight. And he had an article called Is BDD Dying? Which I thought was interesting. And then I went to his blog and he has a ton of stuff about behavior-driven development. It seems to be an area that has been a big part of his career. And I'll just read the first thing here. These days, folks keep asking me an uncomfortable question. Is BDD dying? Behavior-driven development has been around for about 20 years, but recently it feels like the movement has stalled. Is BDD dead? Are we really at this point? No, heck no. Anyway, so it goes on from there. So I thought it was an interesting read. So if you'd like to learn a little more about that, again, I didn't have the background with it. He definitely talks about Gherkin and Cucumber and all these other kinds of fun stuff that we dug into back in episode 239. So a little bit of follow-up there. And that leads us into our rest of our show. We got a bunch of news releases and so forth, and then topics and a fun discussion this week along with our projects. So what do you got for news?
Yeah, a bit of a mix, like you said, releases and announcements. And for starters, we'll go with bugs. So security release for Django, which bumps us to 5.175013 and 4.220. It's a potential denial of service and security in the text wrap function and its corresponding word wrap template filter. So if you're not using that or you're not using it for user inputted content, then you're fine. Otherwise, you should upgrade. And on the topic of Django, they have released beta 1 of the 5.2 version. 5.2 is scheduled for April 2nd, so it looks like it's kind of on track. Sticking with the Django theme, DjangoCon Africa has announced its call for proposals. This year's conference is in Arusha, Tanzania, and it's from August 11th through the 15th. The call for proposals is open until March 31st, so you've got some time to get something in if you're interested.
All right.
And that's the Django stuff. So sticking with the conference theme, PyCon US's schedule has been announced. All the keynote speakers, tutorials, talk tracks, and all that kind of good stuff have been posted, so you can check them out. PyCon US is in Pittsburgh from May 14th to the 22nd, and that's getting close. Time flies.
Yeah.
And out of conference land and back to release land. So there's a bug fix for PyPy. We spoke about this, the alternative interpreter, a few weeks back, and it's been bumped to 7.3.19. Just a quick little patch kind of thing with some odds and ends in it. And last but not least, Poetry has hit its 2.0 milestone. The big change from this one is support for the project section in pyproject.toml, which is nice, as it means all the tools are sort of heading for that same master configuration thing.
Yeah.
And how's that for a segue? Not just a silly pseudo scooter, it's also a clean way of transitioning from one topic to the other. So there you go.
Yep. I definitely see what you paved there. So yeah, my first one is from Real Python, and it's from one of our former team members, Ian Currie, and he's still doing some writing for us from time to time. The tutorial's titled How to Manage Python Projects with pyproject.toml. And I've mentioned a video course that Ian and Gerana Hiela did a few years ago. It's on the same subject. It was in this theme that we were calling code conversations. We're still probably going to do some more of those. We haven't done them in a little while, but I'm excited to see that kind of come back as a video course style. But this one was titled Everyday Project Packaging with pyproject.toml. That's hard to say quickly. It was a bit like following along with them in a pair programming session where Gerana is kind of leading Ian through it, and they build a simple command line app and take you through how to configure not only the pyproject.toml file, but along the way you kind of learn how it's become this sort of officially, as you mentioned, sanctioned way of setting up your Python projects, which is nice to see this sort of consolidation, and went through the steps of like installing the project locally with pip and so forth. And this tutorial that Ian has done is a bit of a follow-up, but also really sits nicely next to it and includes a lot of additional resources, which I'll mention as we kind of go through it. It explores how it can simplify and streamline the setup of your projects. Tutorial goes through similar steps that you might have seen. In fact, uses the same as very simple CLI application. It's like a Python version of Cowsay, if you've ever run that as sort of a test thing in terminal. In this case, it's called SnakeSay. And Ian shares in this whole thing lots of code samples, of course, project structure layout sort of stuff with the actual TOML file being listed there, and then configuration of those things. The .toml files have a structure, if you're not familiar with it, that are called tables, and they have this design where they are a pair of square brackets around whatever the table name is going to be. And then underneath it, they'll have these pairs of dictionary-like sort of keys and values where you'll say, oh, this requires equals, and then the name of it. So it's a pretty familiar style layout. The TOML format is popular for configuration. It's nice. I think the name is what Tom's obvious markup language, I think something like that, TOML. The example file that he's creating starts with a build system table. In this case, they're using setup tools, and kind of shows how that would be configured, and a build backend for that. There's a table for the project. So in square brackets, project, and then name equals SnakeSay, and then version equals, in this case, 1.0. And then a table that I wasn't familiar with, which I'm excited this kind of gets into, which is how you can sort of configure to have it launch as a script. So there's a project.scripts table, and then you can say, what is the command that you're going to type for the script, and then what does it point to as far as launching it. Ian explains his decisions throughout the piece. I won't go too deep into all of that sort of stuff. It's very detailed, which I like. There's links to various PEPs, the Python enhancement proposals that are involved in moving Python from its messy packaging roots towards what we kind of have now and improving steadily, in my opinion. Ian covers why you should install your Python project once you've configured your initial pyproject.toml file. You take advantage of the import system. Installing your project is generally the recommended way to work with your Python projects, and it comes with a bunch of other benefits. To install it, you do a -m pip install with a -e at the end of it. The E indicates that you're creating an editable install. Again, lots of asides about the individual files that are created when you run these commands. You get into what are eggs versus wheels, and sdis versus wheels, and so forth. So if you're interested in learning more about any of those, there's links to deep dives into all of this. historical records of the Python Packaging Authority and Python Package Index, PyPA and PyPy, as we've mentioned often on the show. After you install, you walk through managing dependencies and how to configure them and maybe lay them out for optional dependencies. Like you could have developer ways of installing the package versus just installing it for personal use. He has a whole section of understanding the context of the pyproject.toml in Python packaging and this desire to have this one universal standard. This is where the history takes on more of a center stage, less links and more of like a narrative thing, which I liked. And then he digs into all this additional functionality using tools that leverage it. So he shows off talks, which you've talked about, this testing library and how you can configure it and saying, okay, what version does it require? And then what environments does it work in? Tables for configuring things like Black or isort and other tools that you use during your development again. And then finally getting into building and distributing your Python project. What are the different steps that you would and tools that you're going to need to submit your project for distribution on PyPy? The final section is a filled out pyproject.toml file example with lots of explanations of all the additions there. A lot of these are optional. There's very few things that actually have to be in there to make it a valid pyproject.toml file. So I like that they go through the additions and show you what you can kind of do if you want to be more of a completionist on this stuff. The piece includes a recent feature that RealPython's been adding to tutorials, which are these sort of collapsible FAQs. So you can confirm your knowledge about frequently asked questions on the topic. And yeah, I'm just excited to see something new from Ian, and I think it's a good tour. If you're interested in kind of a shorter version of it, I think the video course is a great introduction to it. And this actually builds on top of it and adds lots of context. So thanks again, Ian Currie.
It's Tom's obvious minimal language.
Obvious
markup. Minimal language. I figured just in case someone was shouting at the podcast. And of course, that would beg the question, why are you shouting at the podcast? We can't hear you. And of course, that produces a separate group of people shouting at the podcast because I stole that line. So, anyways.
What you got for us?
So, my turn?
Yep.
Yes. My first article is called Build a To-Do App with Python and Kivy, and it's by Francis Ali from the Python GUI's website. It's been a few years since I played with Kivy, so it was nice to read something to refresh my memory. If you haven't come across it before, Kivy is a cross-platform GUI framework which supports Android, iOS, Linux, Mac, and Windows. Although you can use it on the desktop, it's architected for touch and multi-touch interfaces, which means it works really well in a mobile. And I find this is one of those places where a lot of the other GUI frameworks don't excel as much because a lot of them were older and were built before the mobile stuff became so popular. So they can work on mobile, but not usually as well as Kivy does. The article is a follow-on tutorial. So if you haven't done Kivy before, you might want to start with the first article. They've got a link to the primer right there at the top, so you can start there if you need to. The goal for this tutorial is to create a GUI to-do tracking app, which uses SQLite as its underlying store. This is a fairly common architecture for mobile dev. In fact, SQLite is probably the most used database on the planet, as most mobile applications use it. I guarantee you've got several dozen copies of it on your phone. The article starts out by showing you the directory structure that you need for the app, separating your bootstrapping code from files for your widgets and your database interface. And then your first task is to start the layout of the application on the screen. You build a container for an entry field where you're going to write in the new to-do items and a listing area of your existing to-dos and buttons for things like marking them as finished or deleting them, that kind of interface. Kivy comes with all sorts of widgets and layout tools. So to get you started, you begin with a box layout and a single label just to make sure that you can get the GUI under the way. And then once you've got that going, you step-by-step proceed by adding inputs and buttons needed for the application. With that in place, you then add a scrollable list, which is what will contain the existing to-do items. So Kivy takes care of the whole scroll bar and if you need to scroll or don't need to scroll. So this means just a few lines of code can get you doing a fair amount of fairly complicated interfaces. Then you start building a custom widget, and that widget is the actual to-do item. And it's you take another box layout. It's going to be nested box layouts, and you build the component parts inside of it. And since you're inheriting from box layout, you can treat this whole thing like it's a self-contained widget, which means you can add it to the GUI inside of the scrollable list. and Kivy treats it like any other widget. With the GUI out of the way, you need to build an interface to the database. This tutorial uses the SQLite module from the standard library, although I'd encourage you, once you've done that, if you're playing around, to upgrade to SQL Alchemy because it'll make your life easier. You need to implement the create, read, update, and delete actions for the database. CRUD, it's not just for breakfast anymore. And then once you've got your DB code, you just need to do a bit of wiring to add the business logic to the buttons in your application. So this is a great tutorial to start your journey with Kivy. Clearly written, helps you through it step by step. So, who says you can't do Python on mobile?
Yeah. I've been interested in this space for a long time. I followed along on a tutorial, actually a whole book, in doing this for iOS. And doing it directly in iOS, well, it required almost half the book to do a to-do app.
Yeah.
So it's kind of nice to have these frameworks, and again, having background knowledge of Python to help you get started is nice.
Yeah. The one downside, and this is the same with most GUI frameworks, is there's always this tension between, do the widgets come with the framework, or do the widgets try to implement the platform's widgets?
Yeah.
And there's pros and cons of both. Kivy has its own, so it's harder to make the iOS version look like an iOS thing. It's going to look like a Kivy app.
Native, whatever, yeah.
But the flip side of that is you can build it once and it'll work everywhere, whereas the other way around, you tend to have to do all sorts of customization and changing the layouts and all the rest of it because you've got platform-specific stuff. So a lot of it depends on what you're trying to attack.
Yeah. So I have a article by previous guest, Marco Gorelli, who we've had on the show to talk about narwhals, which is a great tool for developers who are writing stuff that's moving between databases, kind of continuing a theme there, or between DataFrame libraries and so forth. So definitely check out that conversation if you're interested. And you may have heard us mention DuckDB lately a lot in these conversations about data science. It's very robust and very performant, and I'm looking to have somebody on the show to discuss it soon, but DuckDB seems to be all the rage in the world of data science. So this piece is interesting. The title is Mastering DuckDB When You're Used to Pandas or Polars. It's on the Quant Site Labs blog. I think mastering may be a bit much, but you do explore 3 techniques that a data scientist, or especially someone who's from the finance world, would be interested in doing. One is centering a variable, which is subtracting it from its mean and aligning that stuff, how to sort of resample by time, and then computing rolling statistics. So if you're interested in those kinds of ideas, he sets up these scenarios for 3 of these samples with code examples. And he points out, like, okay, well, why would you want to use SQL with DuckDB directly? Isn't that the point of having all these lovely DataFrame libraries? And Marco provides 4 potential reasons. Stability. DataFrame APIs change and things may be deprecated. And are the techniques that you've learned now going to be around 5 years from now? And SQL probably will, because it's been around forever. And portability. So similarly, SQL standards exist, migrating your code across all of these different places. There's a widespreadness and familiarity with different users. And then a robustness, something I haven't had to do much, but I guess would come across in places that use SQL often, is that there are lots of testing frameworks, and there are testing frameworks that exist for SQL queries specifically that will test across the query and make sure that it's compliant. So the piece shows off writing the same query across pandas and then polars, and then in DuckDB, it's using quote unquote friendly SQL syntax, which is the DuckDB's own SQL syntax. And the code examples are real short, which I like. I think there's a good intro to this to someone who's interested in exploring SQL in DuckDB, but the whole thing is just a quick exploration and then concludes with, what if you don't want to write SQL directly? Again, and he's showing this off, but more than likely you're already using other tools, and kind of this is an exploration of it. So he mentions a few tools that allow you to do something similar. SQL Frame, which transpiles the PySpark API to different backends, including DuckDB. DuckDB has a Python relational API. It's something that's new. The documentation's a bit scant. There's an operation that he shows in there called a window expression, and it isn't really supported. That's the one where you're sort of shifting time. He has a little shout out for his own project in there. You could look at narwhals, which transpiles the polars API to different backends. In this case, again, it's using DuckDB's Python relational API. IBIS, which I've had a deep conversation with Philip Cloud in episode 201 about IBIS, and it transpiles its own API to a variety of different backends. It's a different tool that's in this sort of space. But I like that it was a nice short introduction and kind of shows you what these things look like. And again, if you're not a SQL person, or you are, there are different reasons why you might want to approach this. So thanks, Marco.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing as well, right? Like,
right.
Oftentimes in the data science, you suck it down into the database, you've sort of got a permanent there, then you pull it out of the database into your data frame and do something and put it back in, right? Like it's another tool in the tool chest.
They're written differently too. So like if you're coming from a certain angle, you know how to do something in this way, which is interesting. Yeah.
We've linked to and talked about articles on Mark Litwinchik's site a fair number of times. Usually he's doing like visual analysis of some satellite picture, and it tends to be like a very practical, polars or pandas to grab this, to do that with that data. He often is using DuckDB underneath in order to bring all the data together. So we'll provide a link to that. So if you want some like really hardcore examples of doing some data analysis and mixing and matching tools to achieve it, he's got a lot of good writing on his site about that stuff.
This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. It's the one that I was mentioning when I discussed pyproject.toml files earlier. It's titled Everyday Project Packaging with pyproject.toml. And in this code conversation, you'll follow a chat between Ian Currie and Geran Ahiela, demonstrating the officially sanctioned way of setting up your Python projects using a pyproject.toml file and installing your package with pip. This technique includes a set of benefits, such as being able to call your project from anywhere, playing on the same team as the import system, allowing for inconsistent imports, and having one file that'll work for many build systems. And along the way, you'll learn about structuring files and folders in your project, understanding different ways to run your script, exploring how the import system works, exploring the Python packaging world, and writing a pyproject.toml file to configure your package, along with installing your package with pip. You also dive into various rabbit holes along the way as Ian and Garana talk about all the aspects of the process. Real Python video courses are broken into easily consumable sections, and where needed, include code examples for the techniques shown. All lessons have a transcript, including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the enhanced search tool on realpython.com. So what do you got next?
My article is from Real Python. It's some Real Python content by Ian Currie, and it's called How to Work with Polar's LazyFrames. I've been playing with polars a lot lately. I'm very happy with it. It feels more Pythonic to me than that other bear. In fact, my Polar videos course just launched a couple of weeks ago, and it's called Working with Python Polars. I mentioned the course because it's an intro and overview, and although I do talk about LazyFrames, Ian's article is a deeper dive. So if you're new to polars, maybe start with the course and then move to Ian's article.
Yeah.
If you've already done some polars, then you can start at Ian's article. Polars, like other data sciencey toolkits, has the concept of a data frame, which you can think of like a spreadsheet in memory or a database in memory, I guess.
Yeah.
It's all rows and columns, man, the whole thing. And so
tables, yeah.
So it stores rows and columns of data, and then you execute your queries on that data. And the most common way to get data into a data frame in polars is to call one of its read functions. So, for example, read CSV, which reads a CSV data file and then creates the frame for you. So a lazy frame is a special kind of data frame where you can chain queries together before they get executed and then do all of the work at once. This is a really powerful concept because Polars has a query optimizer built in. Chaining the calls together allows Polars to figure out the best way to run the code you want to build. So instead of using a read function to create a lazy frame, you use a scan function. And there are scan functions for pretty much each of the read functions. So you can scan from CSV, Excel, JSON, Parquet, and a whole bunch of others. including databases, if I remember correctly. A read function reads all the data and then constructs the data frame. A scan function does pretty much nothing. It just essentially returns you a LazyFrame, and it kind of contains a pointer to the file as to where it's going to get the data from, and that's it. So say you want to filter and will only be operating on a subset of data, you can chain the filter to the LazyFrame, then chain your operation. For example, I've got a list of customer orders and you want to apply a discount for anyone from Canada. You would chain the filter on the country with the math operation. And then once you've got all the operations all set up, you call the collect method on the query, and that gives you the result. In a regular data frame, every single row needs to be processed, whereas with a LazyFrame, pollers can quickly throw out the data that isn't of interest when it's scanning the file and apply the operations, in this case, only to the Canadian data. This means far less content has to be in memory at any given time, and it ensures that calculations are only performed on the subset of data, which tends to make things faster. As the article is solely on LazyFrames, it assumes you know some Polar stuff already, so everything I spoke about here is covered rather quickly. The majority of it talks about how the query plans work, how you can see your query plan, how to optimize these things, and then dives further into how you can deal with really large data sets by enabling the streaming feature. Streaming causes Polars to process chunks of your data at a time, and to drive this point home, Ian's article shows you how to process an 80 gigabyte file, which is probably more RAM than you have, depending on your machine setup.
Yeah.
So I think LazyFrames are one of my favorite features of Polars. And on their own, they make the library well worth checking out. If you want to understand them better and learn how to deal with bigger data sets, Ian's article is a great place to start digging in.
Yeah. The whole idea is you're really having this library customize the query for you, which is really kind of neat. And it avoids like this waiting period of like, well, bring in all the data and then we'll just figure out what we need from it. It's like, no. That's inefficient. So
yeah, there's a long history in the database world of doing query optimizations, and there's a lot of hardcore math, and this is, I don't want to call it a solved problem, but there's a lot of work in this space. And so they've basically built on top of that and brought it into the data frame world, so that you're not paying some of the costs that you would do with other libraries. So yeah, no, it's a very brilliant take on it. I find the library easier to use myself. I just find it more logical. The way I think about things is the way it thinks about things.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not a selling point. But
it is to you.
It is to me at least. Yeah. But on top of that, under the covers, it's doing some very, very brilliant things as well. So yeah, it's a bear that makes me happy.
What's funny is that there's all this sort of initial outcry of like, where are the indexes? And man, I haven't heard that in maybe 9 months. So it's like people are like, oh yeah. Maybe we don't.
Maybe I don't need them. Yeah.
So, yeah. All right. Well, we have an interesting discussion this week. It's all about books, and it's from Hacker News. There was a post for a thread. What fiction/nonfiction books should everyone read on the topic of computer science? I've mentioned this, I don't know how many times ad nauseum, that I don't have the experience of going through a dedicated university program on computer science. I had some quote unquote classes here and there in high school and some extra college work that I took here and there, but there weren't many books assigned or people talking about different books to check out and stuff around me. So I don't have a classic approach to this, just stuff I've heard. Of course, being on the show, I've talked to lots of authors and have thought that some of their stuff kind of leans more toward computer science versus just learning pure, what's going on with Python and ideas that were there. In the thread, there are kind of a few sort of, I guess, categories. The ones that I had heard of before, a lot of them that we've mentioned maybe even on the show, that tended toward general design principles and computer science sort of theory. There's not as many fiction ones as I thought there would be, which I was a little disappointed in. But it is kind of a weird thing to discuss in fiction sometimes. And I guess maybe you have to be a skilled author and how to make that interesting. And then there's a few that really border on philosophy and maybe the philosophy of design and how that kind of applies in this situation. And do they span the time period of the last, I don't know, even 60 years, I would say. So I'm trying to think of fiction books that provide advice or examples of computer science, but most science fiction is filled with, in my opinion, cautionary tales. The modern oligarchs finding themselves these as fantastic fertile idea landscapes. What could go wrong? So I don't know if you want to start with like your list and then I can kind of add mine. I don't know if I want to go through their specific list. I'll do a couple call outs, I guess, from stuff that's listed in there. You should check it out. But there's one that was mentioned called The Little Schemer. And one of the reasons I want to mention it is in episode 124, Al was on the show. He had written a book called The Recursive Book of Recursion. And he mentioned this book in his studies, and then he has a review of it on his blog. And it's a pretty funny review. So what do you got for me, Chris? You got a list of stuff?
Yeah, there's a couple mentions on the page that I thought we may highlight a little bit.
Okay.
Off air, we were talking about The Cuckoo's Egg by Clifford Stoll. The subtitle for this kind of tells you what it is, which is Tracking a Spy Through the Maze of Computer Espionage. And although it was from the late 80s, it's a first-hand account of someone seeing their machine at the university was doing things it wasn't supposed to. And the sysadmin basically tried to sort of hunt down the culprit. This is one of these sort of earliest cases of people getting actually, being found and charged and some of that. And our sysadmin is the hero, and it's a true story. So it's kind of neat.
Yeah.
You do need to be careful. There's a popular sci-fi book with the exact same name. And then just to add to the confusion, later in the post, someone refers to it as The Cuckoo's Nest, which is a different book altogether. And that's the one that got made into a Jack Nicholson film. Getting your information from the internet can be fun. Another one that's on here, which I think is sort of perennial, is the Mythical Man Month. This is a classic. It's one of those that I think a lot of people quote, and a lot of people haven't read it, even though they're quoting from it. I waited till later in my career to read this. It was one of those where I sort of went, I really should get around to doing that.
Yeah.
I'd probably been coding for over 20 years before I picked it up. Oh man, is it depressing. It was written in the late 70s and early 80s, and all the problems we have now, they had them then.
Yeah.
So although it's a little funny because the tech stack is mainframes and OS 360, the underlying structure of project managers and how to build software and all the rest of it, we haven't figured that out.
I've heard this one mentioned so many times by Merlin Mann, who's kind of he coined the phrase inbox zero, but he's, kind of into this productivity and so forth. But he mentions it often and had talked to lots of companies. But it has a central theme that adding manpower to a software project that is behind schedule delays it even longer.
Yeah.
Which is, interesting idea. You're like, wait, why? And so forth. So
it's negative productivity, so that there's a cost of bringing people up to speed. And in fact, a good rule of thumb is about 3 months. So if you're a month away from deadline, adding people to the project, you've just added 3 months of cost because those people have to get up to speed.
Yeah.
So it's fun, and it's still true. So another mention is the Phoenix Project by Gene Kim. This is sort of a lean, agile-ish, DevOps-y kind of book. It's very, very high level, so it's kind of aimed a little more at managers. It makes the point, but I find when you're reading it, it's hard not to sort of go through it and go, yeah, but that's not the real world, and it won't work like that. And it doesn't actually get into that. It's written almost like a fable.
Okay.
So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, the one I would suggest instead would be Dreaming in Code by Scott Rosenberg. And he's a little more practical about these things, and it's based on a project that failed. And there's always, good things to learn from failed projects.
Yeah, I always love the phase of we don't call it an autopsy, but what's the term? Postmortem. Yes. Exactly.
Yes. Yeah. Nobody stops and thinks that actually means after death. So yeah. 3 more mentions. Dan Brown's Digital Fortress. So here's some of that fiction for you.
Yeah.
Personally, I think it's one of his weakest books. So I'm surprised it's showing up on the list.
Through it. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a mention for Gödel Escher Bach, which seems to be one of those that's like a perennial on techie lists. Personally, I found this book a slog. I think I'm just not smart enough to get it. But I also wonder whether it's one of those virtue signaling books, being more important to say that you love it to announce just how brilliant you are.
Yeah, we got some of those I'm going to mention in a minute. Yeah.
That might also get angry comments. But I do remember I took this as vacation reading years and years ago. And the guy beside me on the plane saw that I was reading it. And he said, "So how are you finding it?" And I was honest. I was like, "Yeah, there's some neat ideas in it, but I could have done with the summary rather than having to go through the whole thing." And he's
notes,
like, "Yeah, I read it like 20 years ago and I had the same experience. You're not alone." I'm like, "Okay, so
that's good.
Thank you, complete stranger, for validating my opinion." So that's always nice. So,
and then you were introduced to the internet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the last one, which we've talked about on the show a couple times, which is John Ousterhout's Philosophy of Software Design. I can definitely second that recommendation. I know we brought it up, but I'll bring it up again because it's worth reading.
I want to mention two that are interesting and have been just things that I guess the circles that we run in, or if you're interested in self-development sometimes, and this sort of cross-section with that and computer science. So there's one called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which really is not about computer science at all, but it's more about the concept of quality and actually this sort of subtopic of metaphysics of quality. I don't know how well it holds up. That one I have not dug into. The one that people say, "Oh, this is a better version of that." Again, this is opinion. I own this book and I haven't cracked it yet. It's called Shop Class as Soulcraft, an inquiry into the value of work. So those are interesting ones that a lot of people seem to mention, and they're just kind of like mindset things, I think. And again, metaphysics of quality and the value of work. And as a person who cares about quality and so forth, so I think I might get something out of them. But sometimes it's interesting to look at stuff that's more philosophical than anything. There's a few Python authors I've had on the show, and I don't want to necessarily call out people one or the other. I've enjoyed lots and lots of different books here, but I want to mention a couple that are kind of more, leaning toward computer science. One is that I had Dane Hillard on the show very early on, talking about the practices of the Python Pro. And this was this whole sort of graduation from like, okay, you've learned about computer science and maybe Python specifically, but like what happens when you're in an organization? And we talk about that a lot. And he describes that idea of sort of like moving into professionalizing things and looking at structuring your code in ways that allows it to work better within an organization. And I thought it was a really good book on that topic. The book that was introduced to me in Python when I started my first job in Python was the Al Swigard's book, the Automate the Boring Stuff with Python, which we bring up a lot, but that was the one that was handed to me. And, at the actual job, they gave it to me. Here, check this out. If you're a beginner, total beginner, I've had Eric Mathis on the show last week, and I love his Python crash course. I like it partly because of the way that he teaches things. He would rather you get to the point of creating things, which I think is really, really great. Also, he really goes out of his way to never, ever, ever talk down to you. And so like, even if you're a child looking to learn Python, I can see why he's sold over 1.5 million copies of this book. So very, very popular. And then somebody else who's thought a lot about his book, and especially in the revisions, is Luciano Hamayo and his book Fluent Python, and talked about it quite a bit when I had him on the show about, why does he want to talk about these ideas and these concepts that he's taken from lots of other languages in his background in computer science and how to apply them in Python. And I thought those were all good examples. And then something else mentioned, they mentioned William S. Vincent's Django's series of books. I bought these books and I can recommend them. I think they're really good. He constantly updates them, and I have the digital version, so I always get these updates to them, which is really kind of nice. And then there's somebody else who wrote a Django book that I actually like a lot. So do you want to talk about Shepard a little bit, or?
Yeah, I want to get there before we dig in. That there's two fiction books that I wanted to bring up.
Oh yeah, that would be fun.
that didn't actually make the list. I'm one of which I understand because it's kind of a little corner book that I don't think anybody's heard of, but I really like. It's called I Hate the Internet, and it's by Jarek Kobek.
Okay.
And it's basically an angry screed about Instagram. It was written in 2016, and it's still quite relevant today. If I remember correctly, there's some very naughty words in there, so depending on your taste, you've been warned.
Sure.
And then the one that really surprised me that didn't make the list was Stephenson's Snow Crash. That to me seems to be, the sort of the programmer, the quintessential programmer bro book. So
yeah. There's a book that's kind of parallel themes. Actually, two books. There's this author who I always kind of want to go back and read him again because I kind of want to see how I feel about it, having lived through the last 12 years. But Daniel Suarez, I don't know if you're familiar with him, he wrote a book called Daemon, or Demon, depending on how you want to pronounce that word, which is similar, this idea of like metaverses, if you will, and what's happening inside them, and then them being potentially used for foul things. And then there's a follow-up book, which is sort of the fight back against it, called Freedom TM. He writes really interesting stuff. He's kind of like a Crichton-esque in some ways, though Crichton definitely, if you want to read his book about climate science and his other stuff, he's definitely got his own opinions about things, or did, I should say.
Yes.
So we'll include a whole list of all these different things.
For sure.
Definitely a reader's list for people that are interested. I think this is kind of a cool topic to kind of get into, and there's definitely more things into it. You have a few other resources here, I think, though.
Yeah, so I wanted to bring up shepherd.com. So full disclosure, they helped me promote my book. So understand that I might be a bit biased, but I do like their site. What they do is they get an author to post their own recommendations. So for example, on my own page, I've got a book list called Books for a Coder's Shelf. And in it, I've got, Swiggert's Automate the Boring Stuff, Ousterhout's book, a tech book that is a little bit of a hard to read, but I love the idea, which is Refactoring Databases by Ambler and Satellage. Database people tend to think databases must be top down, and this book basically shows you that they can be organic if you use views the right way. So I find that very, very helpful. And I've got, the C programming language K&R book on there, as well as one about open source licensing. So if you dig around on Shepherd, you'll find similar pages from other authors. Yeah. So a bunch of Python folks. So Jamie Buelta, who wrote Python Automation Cookbook, he's got a list. Daniel Zingaro, who wrote Learn to Code by Solving Problems. And Noemi Cedar, whose Quick Python book, which is really, really good, just got its 4th edition out.
Yeah, I saw that.
Can definitely recommend that one. So if you like an author, there's a chance that you'll like what they like to read as well. And so then the idea here is you sort of go and see what they recommend.
Yeah, definitely. If you like the style of an author, it's a great way to find stuff that has influenced them potentially, or that they dig.
Yeah, exactly. And in the nonfiction world, it tends to be at least the stuff that they find useful, right? It acts as a nice filter that way. And then one last shout out. So I've mentioned on the show before that I'm on Library Thing, which is like a Goodreads sort of site. For those who are curious, my reading list is public. So we'll put a link to that. You can see everything that's actually on my physical bookshelf at home, as well as everything I've read since I started cataloging, which was only about a year ago. But so if you're looking for a random, there's some book from some guy, there's a list you could work your way through if you're interested.
Yeah. That was fun. So this week for projects, I'll start. I have a project that's called preswald. It has a little monkey as a emoji at the front of it. So I don't know if that's the the preswald there. I'm not sure where the origin of the name, but full stack platform for interactive data apps is its subtitle. And this is from Structured Labs. I'll just read the description from GitHub repo because it is pretty short. A framework for building and deploying interactive data apps, internal tools, and dashboards with Python. With one command, you can launch, share, and deploy locally or in the cloud, turning Python scripts into powerful, shareable apps. So again, I talked about this a lot with Eric, this idea that I get to review projects from time to time, and I don't necessarily write up good or bad or whatever, but I review them in the sense that I try to stand them up and try a few things out with them and see what I think of them. And this was very easy to install. I used UV, created a virtual environment, UV pip installed it, ran the commands. It installed a whole bunch of stuff, which was very interesting. So it leverages a lot of common Python libraries. It will run locally, which is nice, but it has a built-in sort of hosting option that's through your GitHub account. And just very quickly, if you let them sort of connect to your GitHub login, builds you a free demo developer account, which I thought was really interesting. So a very quick process there. It leverages a lot of the tools we've discussed here, even lately. Pyodide, which I've mentioned a bunch of times, the idea of running Python in the browser. And then Fast API is what they're using for the backend on this. There is also some React in there as a front end. It's very minimal in a way that's not distracting. And meanwhile, it's very attractive. I like it. It looks nice. And it even looks like there's like settings for like setting up your own branded color schemes and so forth. The documentation is good to get you going. I feel like there's some more areas where they could kind of focus on, well, what do you do as far as dashboards? But there's lots of examples to kind of tie to that I think that maybe that would supplement the documentation there. A couple things in the documentation I have not seen before commonly. One was this configuration one that is like settings for connections, theming, and logging. It uses a preswald.toml file, and many things go beyond the title and versioning. There's like a whole branding section connecting to data sources and logging configuration. There's another one called core concepts, this whole section in their documentation that shows what's happening structurally with the project. It actually gives you like lots of flow charts and so forth. And so I like it because it shows like, well, how did they design this thing and what was their thought process in it, and where do the different libraries that you might be familiar with come in to play. It integrates with a Fast API backend, a React-based front end, and then a real-time WebSocket communication layer and a workflow execution engine. So it kind of reminds me a lot of Marimo, but in some ways it's a little more structured around React and not so much of a notebook. I've covered a bunch of these projects that have talked about Pyodide, and I'm still interested in distribution of your tools and so forth, and I'm into making dashboards. So I'm always wondering what next tools I could be using. So this looks interesting, and I'll keep looking at preswald in the future. What's your project?
I've got something called terminaltexteffects, and it's by someone who goes by the handle Chris Builds, all one word, on GitHub. A podcast probably isn't the best medium to be talking about this, as it's a rather visual library.
Sure.
The idea is essentially funky text animations in your terminal. I think the easiest example to describe would be The Matrix, which made me go look it up, and I got all depressed. That movie's 26 years old now, and so there's a chance some of our listeners weren't born, but it's enough of a geek movie that I think the references would be understood, that green on black text with the text flowing down. So one of the effects is just that. So you can basically build that kind of thing with this library. The library works by creating animation frames, which can be iterated over from an effect. The first example in the quick start guide is an effect known as rain. You give it some text and it looks like it rains down from the top of the terminal. You instantiate the effect, then iterate over it in frames. And then in each iteration, you call the print on the terminal, essentially doing flipbook style animation with terminal controls. And then you display your frames and do any logic that you need on each one of those pieces. There are a boatload of effects to play with, including beams, black hole, bouncy balls, bubbles, fire, laser etch, printer, and a lot more. One of them's called VHS tape, but if you were born if you were born after The Matrix was released, then I'd have to explain both what VHS and tape is. So let's just skip right past that. All told, there are 39 effects and counting. So if you want to follow the white rabbit to the leather coat wearing pharmacist who provides the red pill, or otherwise just want to have some fun in your terminal, this library's worth checking out.
Yeah, there are demonstrations of all of it. I've been kind of looking at it in the background so you can kind of get an idea of what it looks like.
Yeah, it's a fun toy.
Yeah.
It's definitely a fun toy.
You can make things look old or interesting. So, but yeah, very, very fun. Well, thanks for bringing all these projects and topics this week, Christopher.
Always fun to be here.
All right, talk to you soon.
Bye.
I want to thank Christopher Trudeau for coming on the show again. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and I look forward to talking to you soon.